Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. I'm David Skok, the CEO and editor-in-chief of The Logic. Today, we have a really exciting conversation with Max Chafkin, the author of a new book called The Contrarian, I got to put it over here so you can all see it. The Contrarian, about Peter Thiel and Silicon Valley's pursuit of power. First, I just want to welcome all of those who are not subscribers to this event. This is what we do as part of a Logic subscription, so we hope that you'll enjoy this conversation and consider subscribing for more great talks, as well as great journalism from our reporting team who cover Canada from across the country. We have a team across the country and who cover really Canada's transformation and knowledge economy. I also want to welcome our subscribers who we hope through this call will get a sense of us as well. All right, so let me bring in Max, who's joining us. And I also should point out, if you have questions, we want your questions. If you put them in the chat box, we will sort them out. And throughout the conversation, we will ask your questions as well. So first, let's bring in Max. Max, welcome and thank you for joining us this afternoon.
Hey, thanks for having me, David, and thank you to everybody for joining. This is my first virtual event in Canada, so super excited to be here. I'm sad we're not doing it in person in some way, but it's still really fun to be here with y'all.
Me too, and we're honored to have you. This book is quite something. I couldn't put it down, and I have a lot of questions to get through. I wonder, if, just first at a high level, if you could tell us. The Peter Thiel that people think about is such an interesting thing. He has become such a character, a secretive. Words like secretive get thrown around, mastermind gets thrown around, evil genius get thrown around by some people. So, who is Peter Thiel? Give us a little sketch about the man.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you say, part of what drew me to this story, part of why, I wanted to write it is because he does have this kind of larger than life, persona. On the left, of course, he's seen as this kind of vampiric, data hungry, crazy right winger. And on the right, he's seen as this, Superman who's both, this amazing intellectual, and a badass, builder who's, willing to take on the liberal media and, make the future happen. Thiel, I wanted to cut through both of those stories and kind of understand who this person is. I mean, of course, both of these stories have some truth, but they're not the whole truth. And there's just an amazing kind of human story that runs through them, and also a story about how power works, and how, in particular, tech power works. Just to give people kind of a broad sense of Thiel, he's this, really important venture capitalist. Probably most people know this. He was the co-founder of PayPal. PayPal was sold to eBay just after the dot-com bust for about $1.5 billion. And there's this diaspora of former PayPal people who go all over Silicon Valley, become known as the kind of PayPal mafia, with Peter Thiel as the leader. And PayPal, the lessons of PayPal and many of the sort of things that happen, had this profound influence, on Silicon Valley that I'm sure we could talk about. Thiel goes on to start Palantir, this, giant defense contractor and data mining firm. He, crucially is the first outside investor in Facebook, really the first person to look at Mark Zuckerberg and say, this guy is going to be something. This company is going to be something. He's been involved in, dozens of super well-known companies that many people have heard of. He was a crucial investor in Elon Musk's SpaceX, investor in Lyft, Airbnb. It goes on and on. And all of this, I think, would make for, a really cool book about, how tech power works, because of course these are really powerful companies, if Thiel hadn't also been super involved in politics. And as most of us are probably aware, in 2016, Thiel was kind of the first big time business person to get behind Donald Trump. He gave this big speech at the Republican National Convention and made a big donation to Trump just before November 2016 that I think was crucial to Trump's eventual win, and had this important role in the White House. So you have these two poles going on. You have this guy who is famous as a futurist, this amazing forward thinker, who also happened to back, a reactionary populist who, in many ways, seems very hostile to tech industry. So that creates some interesting tensions that I'm sure we can, of course, talk about.
For someone like me who just, cursory was looking at Peter Thiel's life and career over the last 2 decades, the culmination, it seemed, of going to speak at the convention was the beginning of a new chapter. But in fact, what I found so fascinating about your book is actually, no, it was full circle. This was actually where he started. He was, back in his Stanford days, a provocateur, someone who really did have more of an intellectual bent that you could have seen him writing for Harper's Magazine and going down that path more than becoming a venture capitalist. Tell us a little bit about his childhood, but also that formative period in college.
Yeah, absolutely. And Thiel is one of these people who, if you ask somebody in the mid '90s, who's this guy Peter Thiel, they would have said, "Oh, well, he's a very promising young conservative political activist." And actually, that answer would change, in the 2000s, and it would change again, in the 2010s. Thiel, as you said, he was this college political activist. Let me just talk a little bit about his background. Just bring him up to before college. He's from, as some people probably know, he's German born. His family moved around a lot. This is an immigrant family, German evangelical Christians. Thiel himself was introverted, kind of genius type, and kind of unsurprisingly, given the fact, that he had this kind of somewhat itinerant childhood and that he was an introvert, he was bullied as a child, and he had kind of a tough time, I think, in junior high school and high school and even in college. But what happens in college that is so interesting is he kind of takes all this sort of anger or whatever, the chip on his shoulder that I think had been there for some time, and pours it into this newspaper called the Stanford Review. And the Stanford Review was, I think, provocative is probably a bit of an understatement. I mean, Thiel saw Stanford as this bastion of liberal thought and kind of, elite liberalism. And he kind of really wanted to, poke it in the eye. And it was all about finding ways to provoke and going right up to the line and sometimes, frankly, crossing the line on things like race and gender. And this notion of diversity. I mean, Thiel was, making news, making national headlines in the mid '80s, arguing that, colleges were becoming overrun with multiculturalism and stuff. And I think when you look at that period and you kind of then look at the alt-right, which takes off, around 2014, 2015, same kind of thing. And they really do owe an ideological debt, I think, to Peter Thiel. And it's not surprising that Peter Thiel, who was kind of a pioneer of this kind of, young conservative, provocative tactics, would see something in the alt-right and would ultimately see something in Donald Trump.
All right, I'm going to geek out with you a little bit on the reporting because I am fascinated in how you actually reported this book. We'll come to Gawker, so leave that out of it for now because obviously it's this thing that must have hung over your head throughout this reporting and maybe your editors at Bloomberg through the years as well. I'm not sure. But just thinking of the Stanford Review, the amount of writing he did, the amount of his own words that you were able to glean through his work, how much time did you spend in the Stanford library? And I think it surprised me at how much of his work was so publicly accessible, including writing these books that he's written throughout the years.
Yeah. So as you said, and it's probably important to say, Thiel, I approached this as kind of a journalistic project. So as I said, I didn't want to buy into the kind of conservative Ayn Randian myth. I didn't want to buy into the liberal myth of Thiel as a supervillain. I wanted to write a balanced book that really took him on as a human being with empathy, but also, was unafraid to be clear-eyed about his failings, about the things that are a little bit scary in his ideology. I approached Thiel early on and had this kind of long-running conversation with his PR people that ultimately led to an off-the-record meeting. There was a fact-checking, long fact-checking memo, and ultimately, he didn't comment either in that meeting or in response to the fact-checking memo. So the book is built on hundreds of interviews with sources who are basically friends, former colleagues, people who went to school with him, anyone who's been in this kind of Thiel universe for any kind of substantial amount of time. And as you said, his writing. And because one thing that makes Peter Thiel so interesting is that he has created this insane corpus, and it's a book, or two books actually, 0 to 1 and The Diversity Myth. 0 to 1 is his kind of startup manifesto. I'm guessing a lot of folks on this call have read it, and it's definitely worth reading because both because it says something, I think, about how the tech industry is set up, and also like it's a very interesting window into Peter Thiel's thought process. The Diversity Myth is very caught up in its own time, and it's all about kind of sticking in the eye of the elites. It's very similar, if you're familiar with the work of Dinesh D'Souza or Ann Coulter. It's very much in keeping with that kind of conservative provocations. And of course, Thiel is kind of that same generation. The Stanford Review was modeled on the Dartmouth Review, which is Dinesh D'Souza's paper. And then there are these issues of the Stanford Review. And actually, the interesting thing is, so it's not that much, right? It's a few. Thiel was on campus for 6 years. You have to go to the Stanford Library to read it, or most of it, because it's not on the internet. And Thiel has these has written editor's letters, which I read. But really, what's most interesting in the Stanford Review is kind of his work as an editor, not in his actual writing, and because his writing is actually quite bland. I mean, it's not going to knock your socks off. But the thing that does kind of knock your socks off is the stuff that the Stanford Review published during that era. So. And I'm going to avoid just going too far with it, but I'll give you kind of one example of a sort of famous incident that Peter Thiel was involved in. So in the early 90s, when Thiel was a law student, his good friend and PayPal is a fellow PayPal mafia member who's a very prominent Silicon Valley investor now, Keith Rabois, stood outside a faculty member's house and shouted a gay slur and said, "I hope you die of AIDS." And this was a huge scandal at Stanford. It led to protests and counter protests. And Thiel, in The Diversity Myth, took up the mantle of these protesters were discriminating against Keith Rabois. He was just exercising his right to free speech. This was a free speech stunt, and people should respect that. And they treated Keith Rabois as a victim of kind of the liberal establishment. Of course, I think, especially now, but even then, right? And I talked to a lot of people who were on campus then. What he said was undefensible, but of course there is something, I think, attractive to conservatives about a young Stanford student willing to kind of stand up to the man. And that energy, that kind of activist conservative energy, you can see that in PayPal. And I talked to a lot of early PayPal employees, and they talked about how this kind of Stanford Review crew, they were very close, they were very tight. They had a sense that it was them against the world, and you see that come through in both the ways that PayPal kind of messaged. There's a lot of libertarian messaging in the early years of PayPal, but I think also that cohesion, for better or worse, really helped the company and probably allowed it to succeed during the dot-com bust when so many other companies failed.
Yeah, you make passing references to throughout the book, I think, to some of the prescience that Thiel has had in some of the ventures that he's taken on, or some of the issues that he's taken on. Whether you agree with how he feels about these issues is kind of a moot point. But even thinking about his time at Stanford, wokeism and the left, or these are issues that are very live today, 34, 35 years later. Another one is digital currency. And so talking about PayPal, the early days of PayPal, how that was, a lot of the language was very similar to some of the language that the cryptocurrency crew talks about.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is really underappreciated. So PayPal, first of all, Peter Thiel is a great marketer. And he's particularly a great marketer when it comes to sort of selling into bubbles and finding ways to like take a message and mold it to the time. And the way he talked about PayPal in the 90s in the late 90s was as this kind of libertarian project. He gave an interview to Wired. There's this amazing Wired story. It's a great time capsule where he talks about the possibility that PayPal would undermine nation states, because once you have PayPal, it's basically the equivalent of a Swiss bank account. Once the money's in this wallet, the government isn't tracking it, and you're going to be able to kind of, if you live in a repressive country, or a country with currency controls, or a country with a over aggressive, as of course as he sees it, tax regime, it's going to be very hard for regulators to have any kind of transparency into what is in your wallet. And that was really exciting to Peter Thiel at the time, and of course to a lot of other people, because this kind of libertarian thread is, it is really powerful in Silicon Valley, and was then, and continues to be so now. And I think like when you look at that, the way he talked about that, it's very, very similar to the way kind of the average crypto head talks about crypto right now. It's the same kind of, liberation from regulation, and those ideas have been there in the kind of Thiel world for a really long time, and they owe a debt to Peter Thiel. And it's not surprising, of course, he's become very involved in crypto. He's invested in cryptocurrency, directly. He's investing in crypto companies, because, really it kind of all goes back to PayPal.
And of course with Facebook and Libra, but we'll come to Facebook a bit later. Okay, so PayPal, this is my favorite chapter in the book, was the interaction and interplay between Peter Thiel and Elon Musk, these two giants of tech and of the world really at this point. There's a great line in here, and I have to quote it because it's so good. When asked about how these two feel about each other, you have a source who said Musk thinks Peter is a sociopath, and Peter thinks Musk is a fraud and a braggart. Tell us about that relationship, and the culmination, or the climax of that relationship being the power move that Peter made with the board.
Well, and I think that the feelings that you just described, very much relate to this power move. So, two very big and very different personalities. They are almost 180 degrees opposed. So, Thiel is brainy, introverted, super careful. He's run a hedge fund for, basically his entire career. He's really all about kind of thinking about risk and being really smart about risk. And of course, Musk is this, big, larger than life. He's not restrained at all. He wears his heart on his sleeve. He goes wing walking. He's the kind of guy who just like sits in the casino and just bets on the same number, until it comes up. And of course, that's not Thiel. Musk at PayPal. So there were so many, and I talk about this in the book, but people think that digital currency was this like, wow, holy crap idea. But actually there were tons of digital currency companies. What's amazing is that PayPal made it. And there were so many digital currency companies, in fact, that there were two in the same building, that Peter Thiel's digital currency company and Elon Musk's digital currency were in the same building for a very short amount of time. And the two companies merge. It's a merger of equals, an equal merger. But Musk, because he was sort of the more accomplished entrepreneur, he'd already sold a company for hundreds of millions of dollars. He was a sole founder, and he had better investors. He had Sequoia, and Mike Moritz in the company, ends up in charge of this thing. And Thiel gets marginalized, effectively resigns. But as I talk about in the book, kind of engineers this brilliant power play. Musk goes on vacation, goes on his honeymoon for 2 weeks to Australia. It's kind of going to be like he's going to see the Olympics, but he's also going to have some meetings with investors, because of course PayPal is constantly needing to raise more money. And while he's away, Thiel's allies show up at Mike Moritz's office with basically letters of resignation for everybody, and say, either you gotta can Elon, or we're all gone. And at that point, given where the market is, and kind of how unstable, frankly, PayPal was, it's basically saying, you got to get rid of Elon or the company's going to die. And Moritz agrees. And Musk, of course, Musk is somebody who does not take this kind of thing lightly. He rages, but I think what's really telling is that he ultimately kind of comes around to it. And you got to, there's something, first of all, the kind of gamesmanship that of Thiel it's really worthy of respect, no matter what you think about his kind of politics. But also, he is like the only person to ever go toe to toe with Elon Musk and kind of live to tell. Because Musk eventually kind of accepts this and realizes basically, better to have Peter Thiel as a friend of mine than as an enemy. And they make peace. And Elon stays on the board, and PayPal, eventually goes public and sells itself to eBay. And 6 years later, Elon Musk needs a favor. He needs money for his rocket company SpaceX, which had a couple of failed launches, is really struggling. And there's Peter Thiel, who comes in and basically saves the day and gets a piece of SpaceX, which helps right the ship and probably saves Elon Musk from maybe even personal bankruptcy. I mean, he'd really stretched himself thin at that point. I don't think it's clear that even Tesla Motors would have been okay if Thiel hadn't been able to keep SpaceX going, just because of the way Musk is and the way the companies are kind of intertwined. It doesn't make their relationship perfect. Their relationship is difficult. It's kind of like a frenemy thing, or they're friends, but they're rivals. But they've found a way to work together. And I think that tells you something both about kind of how good Peter Thiel is at this kind of strategic stuff, and also kind of the power thing. I mean, he has enough power that even Elon Musk, who really, does not take slights lightly, was able to see past this one.
You talked to Musk for the book. Tell us about how that went, and
Yeah, I mean, Musk,
when asked, how does he deal with
well, he says, he kind of characterizes it the way I've just characterized it. He said that, we're very different people. He said, we're not oil and water, but we're very different people. Peter is a hedge fund guy. He's somebody who likes the kind of an investor, is how Musk talked about him, as opposed to an entrepreneur. He talked about, Peter likes the kind of gamesmanship of investing. I'm not as into that. I'm more just about like, betting on one company and like making it happen. Now, of course, I think that probably, Musk has his own kind of gamesmanship, but there is a really big difference. And I think there is a sense, yeah, I mean, I think the relationship is not perfect. I mean, you don't go on your honeymoon and get fired from your own company and like totally ever forget about that, even if you in the interim, make billions or tens of billions of dollars, as Elon Musk has.
All right, so Peter Thiel then decides to. We're trying to fast forward here, go through it. So he decides to leave PayPal and leave essentially the Silicon Valley world, the venture capital world, almost entirely, and go into hedge fund. Tell us about that, and culminating, of course, with the financial crisis and how that played into it.
Yeah, and this is, I think, a really interesting window into kind of the limits of Thiel's kind of frame. He's famously a contrarian, right? And he's really, really good at sort of looking at what's happening, looking at what the trends are, and kind of finding ways to profit from that, often by either, betting against the prevailing trend or selling into, you can, when you have a bubble, right? You can either sell into it or you can short it. Thiel tends to kind of do both, actually, because he's always had, he has the sort of startup portfolio, which has been, he's able to take advantage of the boom in technology, but he also has this, and has always had this, hedge fund portfolio. Now, in the mid 2000s, as I said, if you'd asked anyone who Peter Thiel was in like the mid 90s, they would have said promising young intellectual. If you asked everyone, average sort of like Wall Street Journal or Bloomberg reader, who's Peter Thiel, they would have said, oh, Peter Thiel is one of the most famous hedge fund managers in the world, because Thiel had some of the highest returns of anyone. He had billions of dollars under management. And he had been doing this in part by betting against the US economy. He was very early to see that oil prices were going up, and that and so he was betting on oil, and that the real estate bubble was unsustainable. Now, he made a ton of money in early 2008, and he saw the financial crisis coming, as I talk about in the book, in mid 2008, and basically psyched himself out. As I talk about in the book, and I talked to some folks who worked at Clarion then, they had this contrarian take, but then they got worried that it wasn't contrarian enough. So they sort of started developing contrarian takes on top of the contrarian take. So they bet they like bet that the market was going to come back before the market, instead of just sticking with their kind of original idea, which is like, okay, we're all doomed. It was like, well, everyone's going to know we're all doomed and the government's going to step in to prop it up. And so as a result, Thiel's hedge fund basically collapsed. I mean, he lost, billions of dollars in assets under management. Basically, it transforms, in a matter of a year from being this huge hedge fund. Peter Thiel's the next George Soros. That's what Barron's is talking about. Bloomberg's talking about that. It goes to being just a family office. And this is a huge come down for Thiel. And I think, as I said, it's kind of a window into the limits of this kind of contrarian method, because, contrarianism is like really, it can be really clever. It's like an amazing trick for cocktail parties. And I'm sure there are other, I definitely use this sometimes, and it really is a great way to kind of be provocative or whatever. But actually trying to act on those insights is very tricky. And that's where Thiel has at times, I think, run into trouble.
There's a question from the audience, which is a good one, and it ties in, I think, a bit to Gawker. So maybe we can touch on it here. But what is the relationship between Thiel's hedge fund work and MBS and Saudi Arabia's sovereign wealth fund, or more generically, some of the funds that he was was being funded by at that time?
So I don't know specifically whether the Saudi sovereign wealth fund had money in Clarium, or has money, has invested money with Thiel. I know that Thiel has had and has Middle Eastern investors, which is not surprising. There's a lot of money in that part of the world that's flown into tech startups. In one of the so maybe this is a time to just bring up Gawker, because the Gawker thing coincided with the collapse of Thiel's hedge fund in 2008, around the exact same time that his hedge fund was collapsing. Gawker does this story that says that Peter Thiel is totally gay people. At the time, Thiel's gay, and he was out within the company, and his friends, of course, knew about his sexuality, but he hadn't been out publicly in that way. And he takes this, I think, unsurprisingly, as a violation, and takes it very personally, and I think is just really upset by it. At the same time, his hedge fund is falling apart, and Gawker doesn't just stop there, because that's the thing that's so kind of confounding about this Gawker story, is that Gawker was doing this kind of like really tawdry, sort of trashy stuff that I think, especially in retrospect, but even at the time, was pretty bad journalistically. But it was also doing kind of good journalism. So Gawker was kind of cataloging all the ways that Thiel was failing, and kind of writing about, Clarium's poor returns. And Thiel goes to Davos the following year, and Gawker does a post about what a not genius he is. And so I think what happened is, Thiel got off balance, right? And in that period of being off balance, talking to people who worked with him at the time, he partly blamed Gawker. And one thing that has been speculated about, and even has been speculated about by Peter Thiel, although he's sort of said this is not true, is this notion that there was sovereign wealth money in Gawker, in Clarium. Many of these Middle Eastern countries are super conservative on sexuality. And if they were looking for an excuse to pull their money out, right, Gawker has helped them, has provided them. And not just with one excuse, but like a few excuses, because his sexuality, but also just saying that, what a bozo he is. And I also think, it's very hard to know, when investors pull money out of a hedge fund, right? I don't think you necessarily know like what the reason is, right? And who knows? I mean, his hedge fund, he was giving them all sorts of reasons to pull the money out, but it has been speculated that one of the reasons that Thiel got so upset was because he felt like his business was being hurt by that blog post. And Thiel has basically batted that down. So I don't know. Take it for what it is. There definitely are some of those relationships, although I don't know how major they've been in his, both either in his decision making or anything else.
How much did the Gawker lawsuit weigh on you as you were reporting this?
Well, a lot of people have asked me, like I said, the book is fair and journalistic, but I mean, I'm not afraid I'm trying to give credit where due and give respect where due, but also be critical where I think it's important to be critical. And people say, oh, you've written a critical book about Peter Thiel. Aren't you afraid of him? And I say, yeah, I'm afraid of him. But the thing is, because of course, and the answer is because, this Gawker lawsuit casts a pall over any journalism that's written about Peter Thiel. And now any journalist, not just me, but anyone who writes about him or any of his companies has to think about that. And we're reminded about it every day by the sources, right? Because sources see these lawsuits too. And that's the thing about a lawsuit like this, right? It doesn't just, Thiel talked about it being this really targeted thing, but it doesn't work that way, especially when you kind of give a speech and say, this is my proudest moment of my philanthropic career. It sends a message to any source, to any journalist. And the thing is, the answer is, yeah, I'm afraid, but I would be afraid of any billionaire because Peter Thiel has now created basically a playbook that anyone can follow. There's no reason why we should only worry about Peter Thiel, because this exact same approach could be followed by anyone. Thanks to Thiel, he's created a playbook and also permission structure by going around kind of bragging about it and how awesome it was.
We're obviously going to talk about Facebook and Palantir and Trump, but I just on this, I think it's maybe a good time to talk about what you call the Thielverse, the people who he surrounds himself with, and who now idolize him, for lack of a better word. Some of the younger up and coming people who look up to him. I only bring that up because I'm thinking, yes, the precedent of the Gawker lawsuit may still yet come to fruition in 10 or 15 years when the next Peter Thiel, who worships the man, may want to adopt that playbook. Tell us about this orbit that he's constructed around him, whether intentionally or unintentionally. I'm still not sure. I got an answer to that in the book.
Yeah. I just want to add one other thing. This I think is kind of important. So, as I said, I had lots of back and forth with Thiel's, PR people, right? And although the Gawker lawsuit, hung over me and hung over my reporting, and although I think that it's really important to talk about the chilling effect of freedom of speech, I was never threatened either indirectly or directly, or no one ever did anything directly to cause me to feel like I couldn't do my journalism. And so that is, I suppose, to Thiel's credit. I just wanted to say that. So Thiel, as I said, he's an amazing marketer. And he has, PayPal, as a result of PayPal, you have this, PayPal mafia, this kind of influence network that's pretty small, right? It's just like a couple dozen people or something who are involved in PayPal and who've gotten rich and who are kind of moving money around, investing in each other's companies, giving jobs to each other's friends, kind of banding together to get stuff done. Thiel, starting in 2011 or so, basically creates this way to sort of industrialize his network. So he creates the Thiel Fellowship, which is, I think it's probably best to see it first and foremost as a media stunt. Peter Thiel is going to criticize higher education. He has a very, kind of, I think, well thought through and sophisticated critique of the higher education system in the U.S., which is around, debt and the way that they're piling huge amounts of debt onto graduates without necessarily giving them great job prospects. So he says, you know what? Higher education is so bad. I'm going to pay people $100,000, not just anyone, the most promising people. I'm going to pay them $100,000 to drop out of Harvard and Stanford, and they'll get that money over 2 years, and they should start companies with it. That he accepts 20 people each year into that program. So each year you're adding another 20 or so members to this world, right? But it's not just about that, because Thiel uses this as a platform to get lots and lots of young people excited about it. I mean, this critique of schools, wins followers that is much broader than just the kind of like the people who actually accepted into the Thiel Fellowship. You have the people who apply to the Thiel Fellowship. Some of them, Thiel created sort of ways to bring them in. There were, events and things like that. But then he writes a book where, like, it sells millions of copies, and there is this kind of playbook and this identity. And what's so amazing, I think, about it is, So Thiel doesn't just write kind of a self-help book, but at the end of the self-help book, there's the prospect that you could actually be welcomed into his network. You read this book, you soak up this amazing advice, and at the end of it, you actually might get money from one of Peter Thiel's companies, and or you might get money from Peter Thiel himself, and that is really powerful. And I think that created this really large and substantial following that you see, playing out, on the internet and, on social media and in real life and, in meetings with investors every day. Young people have concluded that they should be like Peter Thiel, and that means following his sort of business precepts, and some of these business precepts are pretty far out there. I mean, 0 to 1 argues that monopoly is the goal of all business, and also these kind of ideological things. So you hear people suddenly kind of talking like Peter Thiel and expressing, and that's where a lot of his influence comes. It's not necessarily like a direct influence. It's him both as kind of an icon and as somebody who actually can kind of bring people into that world.
It's all about deal flow, right? I mean, it's the way I try to think about this stuff in terms of VCs wanting to create attention for themselves and for their funds so that they can get the best companies to come and pitch them and have a chance to invest in them. And then, you've seen especially with different technologies, this one-upping of each other, this bravado on social media and other things about, here are my 10 rules for life and how to make great investments so that you can attract this. And I think what I'm trying to understand is, and I'm sure we'll touch on this more when it comes to Trump, but what motivates him when he's doing these things? Is it as simple as deal flow, and it's a marketing tactic to get more investment opportunities, or is it is there deeper money? Is there a power or ego or intellectual striving that he seeks, or acceptance? What is it that drives him?
So I think it's kind of all of the above. The way I think about it in any case is that there are sort of these two buckets with Peter Thiel. There's kind of a business project, and there the goal is, like you said, deal flow, putting money in Peter Thiel's pocket, and also kind of, I think, more, if you were to be more generous, creating companies that will help create the future, right? Like he's going to invest in these companies, and they are going to accelerate. They're going to bring us more prosperity and increase our lifespans and whatever, and enrich Peter Thiel in the process. He's also an ideologue, and like a lot of times people ask, like, does he actually believe Trump? And there's a temptation to see, everything he did with the Trump administration as just totally venal. But I think he really believes a lot of that stuff. And I think that there is this political project that is also happening at the same time. And I think the best way to kind of think about Thiel is, when I was working on the book, I read Cokeland, which is Christopher Leonard's book about Coke Industries. And it's really well done. And I think there's a parallel there. The Koch brothers had this kind of, industrial conglomerate, and they saw that by, engaging in politics, they could help the conglomerate, but also, forward this political vision. And those two things are tied together. The business is feeding this political project, providing money to it and energy to the political project. And then the political project is helping to change policy, change hearts and minds in ways that help the business. And it's the same thing with Thiel, right? It's a post-industrial version of that, where his businesses are these tech businesses, and his political thing, whereas the Kochs kind of really went after the kind of mainline Republican Party, the kind of normal conservatism, Thiel has gone for this Trumpist, the populist conservatism. And that's the part of the party that he is interested in influencing. But it's the same cycle where the business feeds into the politics feeds back into the business.
For someone who once said, we wanted flying cars, but instead we got 140 characters, he then invests heavily in Facebook and becomes very close and is on the board still to this day of Facebook. What is his relationship like with Mark Zuckerberg, and what is his view of Facebook, even now, given even with the elections in 2016, its role in that election?
Very hard to know. I mean, it is definitely one of, I think, I mean, it's an inside baseball question, but I think it's kind of one of the most interesting questions um, in the tech world because um, so Thiel is, very closely associated with Facebook. I don't think Facebook exists without his help, and I crucially do not think that Mark Zuckerberg is still CEO of Facebook without Peter Thiel coming along and seeing this thing in this, young, rebellious troublemaker, the same kind of troublemakers he was into, when he was at Stanford. Well, of course, Zuckerberg's not conservative, but he's the same kind of like, I'm making trouble for the Harvard administration. And Thiel sees that, sees he's brilliant, and sees that there's real promise with this business and sets Facebook up in a way that allows Mark Zuckerberg to control it. So that Mark Zuckerberg to this day, is basically the absolute dictator of Facebook, this enormous media company with, probably more reach, more influence, more money than any media company in the history of humanity. Thiel has always been seemed a little bit conflicted about Facebook. When Zuckerberg got the famous Zuckerberg in the mid 2000s, I think it was 2007, gets this offer from Yahoo to buy the company for $1 billion. And Thiel is although Thiel ultimately came around. And kind of supported Zuckerberg in his decision to go it alone. Thiel was one of the board members saying, "Hey, you should really sell this company. Time to, $1 billion. This sounds pretty freaking good for a little, dipshit, excuse my French, social media company." And the same, and then we saw after the IPO, Thiel unloaded most of his shares, as soon as Facebook was public, as soon as he was allowed to, he got out, but he stayed on the board. And I think there's some question of why. And I think you kind of have to answer that in two parts. One is, why did he stay? Why did he stay for himself? Like, what was his incentive to stay on the board if it wasn't monetary? And I think, clearly it's a position of influence. And we saw that especially during the Trump presidency, when Thiel was this kind of go-between between Facebook and Silicon Valley and the right. And he was able to kind of push Mark Zuckerberg in certain ways, and also perhaps push Donald Trump in ways to keep Trump from, going, Trump was kind of hammering all these companies on social media, but keep Trump, whatever, from not going too far, kind of, out of control or something like that. From the Zuckerberg point of view, why would you keep around this guy who clearly is so ambivalent about your service? Thiel has, basically been close with all of these conservatives who have been against Facebook. He's kind of he's an investor in Clearview AI, which kind of is gleefully violating, as Facebook sees it anyway, gleefully violating Facebook's terms of service. And I think the answer is that Peter Thiel is more valuable to Mark Zuckerberg on the board than he otherwise would be, because Facebook is constantly under fire from all these conservatives saying it's discriminating against conservative viewpoints and things like that. And Zuckerberg has a great response, which is, look, I've got this board member, Peter Thiel. He's not just a regular conservative. He is a dyed-in-the-wool Trumper. He is so crazy. Steve Bannon thinks he's too crazy. He is the most Trumpy Republican you can find, and he's on my board of directors. He's one of my good friends, and I think that protects Zuckerberg to some extent. And if Zuckerberg wanted to fire Thiel, that would create this huge, media storm that I don't think would be really worth it. Like, I don't think the Peter Thiel cancellation news cycle would be this huge thing that would hurt Zuckerberg. It's really not in anybody's interest. So I think it's another one of these kind of uneasy alliances where they're worth more to each other together than they otherwise would be.
We barely have any time left, and there's so much more to talk about. And if you haven't, the chapter on Thiel's time working in government, setting up teams and names, and what Bannon says about him is really striking. So it's worth reading. I guess I'll try to end it on this one last question to bring in both Palantir and Silicon Valley more broadly. The common misconception of the Valley is that it's a liberal hippie haven, and perpetuated by the late Steve Jobs, and the idea of the Internet Manifesto and other things from the Grateful Dead. Thiel has a completely different view of Silicon Valley, and I'm wondering if you could just end on that note about what is the real Silicon Valley, in his mind, the liberal hippie haven or the military industrial complex, and how the Palantir relationship or company that he runs plays into that, both in the Valley and in Washington.
Yeah. Well, I think, and this is something that I tried to think about a lot in the book. And, I wanted the book is kind of the story of Peter Thiel, but I tried to make it also kind of an alternative history of Silicon Valley. And I say that because, this countercultural thread that you brought up, like, I think it's real and it exists. And there's a reason why a lot of us think, when we think of the internet, we sort of associate it with this kind of countercultural energy. Um, but there's this other story of Silicon Valley, and I think we kind of overvalued, we got so excited about Apple and the fact that Steve Jobs was a hippie who walked around barefoot and didn't use deodorant and and dropped acid or whatever, and Apple was so big, and we sort of forgot about this other story that's always been there, but sort of got pushed to the side, and that is the story of Silicon Valley as the U.S. military-industrial complex, as the Stanford Research Park being basically an extension of the U.S. military, and many of these companies, the great companies that define this industry, got that way by selling, chips and other technology to NASA and to the Department of Defense, and I think in some ways Palantir is a throwback to that, and Palantir, of course, Thiel had this insight that, like, this security technology that he was that he had developed at PayPal could be kind of adapted for security purposes. He saw a really clear market opportunity, which is that post 9/11, George W. Bush and the Bush administration were super excited about data mining, and everybody thought oh, we've missed a lot of warning signs. And Palantir was sort of perfectly pitched to that, but Palantir also falls in this this tradition of Silicon Valley as a military, as an extension of the military. And Thiel's betting on that heavily, and not just betting on it through Palantir, which is a huge piece of his net worth, but he has these other investments. And I think you could see Clearview, which I brought up as something like that, but also Anduril, which is a sort of, they make drones and sensors for the border as another one of these, and I think that's a theme that he has picked up on, and that has been really interesting. But of course, that brings up lots of questions, especially when you're talking about somebody like Thiel, who has some very, very extreme views about democracy. He's skeptical about democracy, and he's made all sorts of comments and kind of flirted with intellectuals who have gone much further. And also the fact that Palantir has kind of put forward at times, a vision of privacy that I think is troubling, where there's the prospect that although maybe Palantir isn't doing anything that we don't agree with, but that at any point one of these users of Palantir could take the technology and do something bad. And I think those are reasons for concern, and that's one of the reasons why I think we need to kind of pay attention to Thiel and scrutinize some of these ideas closely.
The book is called The Contrarian, the story of Peter Thiel, Silicon Valley's pursuit of power. We did not get into the search for everlasting life, or whether he will want to retire in New Zealand or Maui, all of which is available to you in the book if you go out and grab it. Max, thank you so much for talking with me today. It's a really great book. Congratulations, and all the best as you continue on your book tour. Also want to thank our audience for joining us today. We know there are a lot of events out there in this virtual world, and that you took the time this afternoon to join us. We really appreciate it. If you are not a subscriber, I hope you will look at the logic and consider subscribing. I also want to just quickly thank the business team for organizing this event: John Packham, Ariel Lepper-Walker, Amanda Roth, and Jenna Meisner. We will have more events as we go, and we look forward to keeping you up to date on those. You can follow us on Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, everything else that you seek. For now, that is all. Thank you so much for joining us, Max, and thank you all for joining us as well.
Yeah, thanks for having me, and thanks to everybody who tuned in. Really appreciate it.